But hi everyone, my name is Heather Meadows. I am a premium tutor here at Appleroot. Tonight's presentation is about test optional myths and facts, right? So we're going to talk about test optional, what it means, how that changes how we apply for colleges, and what has changed in the past couple of years as well. And so just for a second, talk about Appleroot. We really believe that when you change students' self-beliefs, you change their lives. So we really work with the whole student. We build skills for school and beyond, right? Not just learning, learning geography or learning math or something like that, but we teach them how to, be successful in college and beyond as well. We offer academic tutoring, test prep, AP, exams, SAT and ACT, and a bunch of others, and executive function coaching as well. But tonight we're going to talk about testing and the testing world post-pandemic, right? That includes test optional and all the other changes. And then we'll have questions at the end. So if you don't mind, just hold your questions till the end of the presentation. Some of the technical ones I'll probably get around to. If you have one, just write it down, keep it in your head for the moment. But we got some more people who joined us. Awesome. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's get into this nitty gritty of it. So testing post-pandemic, right? A lot of stuff has changed, honestly. So the new world order is largely test optional. That means you can submit without scores, submit with scores. Either way is acceptable. But that doesn't mean a strong test score is not going to strengthen your application and potentially impact an admissions decision. And we're going to talk about all the different situations where you may or may not want to submit those scores. There are impactful things that are also entirely optional. We've been doing the whole time. Taking rigorous classes, submitting strong AP scores, demonstrating interest, having leadership positions in your activities, getting a high GPA, all those things, right? None of those things have been required. They've been optional, but we've been doing them all along because we know they strengthen our application. And so really test scores have moved from being you are automatically required to send, being something that you have to send every time, to being something more in this category, right? Okay, I'm president of the student council. What else can I add to my resume, to my application that shows, how great of an admit I'm going to be? Test scores could be just another tool in that arsenal, right? We can use to strengthen our application. So what does test optional mean? It means a college will consider an application complete and review it, even if the student has not submitted SAT or ACT scores. They'll assume that if you submit an application without those scores, you didn't want to. They'll assume if you submit one with the scores that you did intend to. The college will receive some applications with and without, and they'll review them equally. And so that's kind of the decision. The decision is, do you send them, right? And the thing we're really doing now is just being more strategic about if we send them or not. And you may send them to some schools and not to others. Again, it's just kind of become something we have to spend more time thinking about here. So more colleges are embracing test optional for the long term. During the early pandemic, when schools were forced into test optional, about 20 to 30% of surveyed colleges expected to return to testing requirements. But they really found that about 68% of schools that were forced to go test optional kind of planned to remain test optional. They kind of found that they liked the results they got from it. So again, this is really the new world order, right? We're going to see this be very common here on out. But again, we're still going to see a percentage of schools who still do require test scores. So there's something else too, right? Harvard has actually decided to go test optional from 2023 to 2026. So they want to do that to get a full graduating class, right? So theoretically, the students who enrolled in 2022 will graduate in 2026. And they want to look at the performance of those students over 4 years compared to other students they had admitted previously with test scores. Test scores are often something that tells colleges if students are going to graduate within 4 years. That's a number they keep track of. They want to look good. And so this is an interesting kind of almost experiment Harvard is doing. And so really, obviously, this is years from now in 2026, right? When we get these results, this will really have a big effect on the world. But as of right now, we are kind of in the middle of that experiment, and some other schools are kind of following this. And Harvard's decision at the end of the day may be a big change. So again, nothing that doesn't really matter for a lot of you guys right now, but just keep in mind that we are in the middle of something changing. There are also a historic number of applications post-pandemic for a lot of reasons, right? By not requiring test scores, you open it up to more students, right? Students who either weren't able to test, who couldn't afford to test, couldn't afford to send the scores, right? It becomes more equitable at the end of the day. So students feel like they can apply to more places. It's easier to apply to more places, right? Without sending test scores. So lots of schools have just seen an increase in that. Big schools like NYU, UCLA, But even I want to point out this example of Colgate at the bottom. Colgate's a small private liberal arts school. I believe it's private. And imagine the probably maybe 4 or 5 person admissions office who usually go through about almost 9,000 applications a year, suddenly getting 21,000 applications. And this is a lot for them, right? Can you imagine the shock they felt? And a lot of admissions offices are becoming really, thinly spread. They have a lot of work ahead of them. And the question is, right, could submitting a test score make my application easier for them just to put me in the yes pile quickly, right? If you think about the workload a lot of these admissions offices have, that's another thing that these test scores can do. They can make it easier for them to make decisions on applications. And then selectives became even more selective, right? Of course, we see some small stuff, right? Small changes like MIT, of course, was already very selective, but 7% and 4% are two different numbers here in this situation. Duke went down from 11 to 4. That's really crazy. At the very bottom, I want to point out Auburn in Alabama. It used to be 81% acceptance rate, which meant, 4 out of 5 kids got in. For the most part, it's pretty much, a shoe-in for Auburn for a lot of students. Now it's 50-50. And again, that's for lots of reasons. Schools, rise and fall in popularity as well. But again, if you're looking at your list of schools you're thinking about, some things have changed. Some schools that weren't competitive before have become more competitive now. And again, test scores at this point are something you can use to strategically strengthen your application with some of these schools that have become more selective. Ivy admit rates plummeted, right? Again, they're also getting more applications. Remember this too. But, again, difference between 4.6% and 3.2% is pretty big when you're thinking of how selective some of these schools were in the first place, right? Penn and Dartmouth are down to 6%, right? So again, if you're looking at these schools too, even though they are test optional, are those test scores something that can really strengthen your application? Or on the other hand too, right, do you feel like you have such a great application, test scores don't add anything to it? At that point, maybe you leave them off. Maybe that's the stronger version of your application. It's a decision to make based school by school, really. With more applicants, fewer test scores, right? Fewer test scores means it takes longer to look at each application. It simply does, right? Less certainty regarding yield, right? Less certainty. When you have more applicants, you still can only take the same number of kids every year for the most part, right? Unless you're building way more dorms and hiring a lot more professors. For the most part, your classes are about the same number of students each year. More admissions offices have really turned deeper to early decision. So early decision applications are where you apply early to a college and you almost kind of sign this contract saying, I'm only applying to you early. And if you let me in, I promise I will go. So it's different than early action and things like that. Early decision is pretty binding. So you're saying, if you let me in, I will go. That looks really great to schools right now with so many applicants and so much work ahead of them, right? If they can have more kids who want to do early decision that look good to them, that's, again, much more appealing. And so you see here, if you look at some of this, right? So for example, look at University of Virginia in the middle. About 30% of their freshman class were early decision admits, which means if you're applying regular admission, only like 70% of the spots are left by the time you're getting to it. Seems like Duke at the bottom, 54%. Half of the class is filled by the time you're applying if you're applying regular admission. So again, two things here, right? Early decision looks better to colleges. If you feel like your test scores aren't super strong or something like that, or you feel like you need something, you need a leg up or whatever, right? Early decision could be interesting for you, right? If you feel like it gives you a better chance. On the other hand, maybe you're not applying early decision. Maybe you need to think about those test scores and if you send them or not, what's the stronger version of your application? Why do they still matter, right? So they're a really good hedge against grade inflation and compression against the US in the US. So, across the nation, schools have started to let students get 4.5s and 5.0s, and I'm exaggerating, of course, right? But a lot of schools have really kind of given these extra points. So a 4.0 is not all A's anymore for a lot of schools across the country. And the thing is, they're all different. So it's not fair to look at one student whose school did a 4.0 scale and another student whose school did a 5.0 scale. The student whose school did he got a 4.5, what's the equivalent at that school? And colleges can't sit there and calculate that for every single student. So now having all A's and looking at those numbers is hard, right? Because again, now maybe they need to sit there and look at the transcript and actually look at the grades they got in each class. And again, it's just more time consuming. And so test scores are a hedge against that because it's an objective third-party number, right? It's something that someone else grades. It's all on the same scale. It's the same across the country. It's a number that's a little bit easier to compare at the end of the day. They're also a strong predictor of graduation within 4 and 6 years. We talked about this with the Harvard experiment, right? In the past, they have been really helpful saying, you know, students with the scores above this typically do well. They typically graduate within 4 years. That's a number we want to keep up. And again, this Harvard experiment will tell us more about that. Test scores are a helpful way to compare a broad, diverse group of applicants, useful for state schools, right? Let's say you're a state school. You have a student applying from a rural area. Their school only offered 6 AP classes, but they took all of them and they were valedictorian. Looks good, great. Okay, you have a student from a metropolitan area. Their school offered 12 AP classes. They took 11 of them and they were salutatorian. How do you compare those two kids, right? You know, one of them took more AP classes. That's because they were simply offered more. You know, one was salutatorian, but there's such a higher competition maybe at that school or something. That's so hard to compare those students, and it's unfair to compare those numbers and what they've done directly. So the question is, how do you do that? Again, that objective third-party number is helpful. Same for students who might otherwise look similar. Let's say you have 2 students from that same metropolitan area. They both take all the APs they can. They both are president of student council. They're both valedictorian. Everything looks the same. One student's got a 32 on the ACT and one's got a 36, which is a perfect score. That's a differentiator, right? Again, an objective third-party number can help in some situations here. It's also still required by public colleges in some states. This is not a complete list, but this is just an example. Typically, a lot of these Southern schools have still required them. So you see some lists here. It is also for those of you, again, I'm in Georgia, so I do know only the specifics about Georgia, but in Georgia, for example, there are some state-run scholarships, and you do have to submit a minimum test score to be eligible for those. Those pay 100% of tuition for public schools in Georgia. I believe South Carolina, Louisiana, some other states have programs like that. So you want to look up those requirements for those scholarships and make sure test scores aren't part of that. Again, it's an important step to take. You don't want to be stuck at the end of the year trying to rush to find a spot, take the SAT, you've never taken it before. There are a relatively small but significant number of schools who won't use them at all. This is called test blind. So this is very different. Test blind means schools won't look at your scores even if you send them. They don't care. They don't believe in scores, essentially, right? Very different from test optional. So, you know, keep those 2 terms in mind. I talked about a minute ago, right? Not submitting test scores can affect merit aid, right? Some schools consider this. Again, some states have these public programs. Some outside scholarships may require these numbers as well. So again, you want to make sure you're checking everything. Really now it's just become, you have to do your research, right? You have to look and see what requires these scores and what doesn't. This is just an example from University of Alabama. University of Alabama, let's say you get in, let's say you didn't submit a test score, you got in, you feel good about it, but you go find this and you're like, oh, if I get a 27 on the ACT, I get $8,000. You're like, I should take the ACT or the SAT, or maybe I should just take the test and see what I get, right? Well, okay, you get a 29. Awesome, you're getting $15,000. But look, if you study a little bit and take it again and maybe bump that 29 up to a 30, that's $24,000. That's a lot of money. That little 1 ACT point or that 10 SAT points, that's worth some studying because that's like $9,000 a year, right? More than you can get. So again, right, schools have these, not all schools have these. It's all about researching the schools you're interested in and checking for these kinds of things, right? Checking to see, you know, is there a test score required to get into the honors college? Is there a test score required for any scholarships or anything? Do certain programs require them or something? Schools can be specific. So again, it's really just about researching your schools and looking and seeing, you know, which schools do I need to send them to for whatever reason. Should I send in my test scores, right? So we just talked about that. The question is, are the scores going to add value to your application? Are they something you want them to see? So, you know, this could change, right? We talked about, you know, merit aid and scholarships. Other reasons could be the programs you're applying to, right? So for example, you know, let's say you're applying to a specific STEM or business program, showing a really high math score or science score looks really good. It helps support maybe a lower GPA or something, right? So again, you want to think about what do those scores say about me? Even what do the section scores like, right? Is my math score really good? My reading score is okay. My math score is really good. And I want to show that off, right? Because you're even getting down to that kind of nitty gritty about it. some other majors, right? Let's say you're a fine arts major. Your scores are pretty good. They weren't like great, but at that point, you're a fine arts major, right? It's okay if your science score isn't tip top at the end of the day. If you feel like they're slightly below average, but they're still pretty impressive, it's just not going to hurt you, right? So again, that's also something that matters. That's, only if schools do have you apply to really specific programs. It also depends on your GPA, right? Average scores may weaken your profile if you have excellent academic credentials. Maybe you're just not a good test taker. Maybe you have anxiety or something else going on, and that's okay. It totally happens. At that point, you want to consider test scores make it seem like something, seem like I'm not as great of a student as I really truly am, shown by my academics. I'm in the honors society. I've gotten awards for my work. I have all A's, all that kind of stuff. Maybe not submitting them is good in that situation because it makes sure that your application makes sense, right? On the other hand, right? Students with test scores well below their grades will likely not benefit. On the other hand, let's say you had some personal stuff going on your sophomore year and your GPA really suffered. So, it's now your junior year. You've really worked hard to pull up your GPA. It's not as high as you'd want it to be just because those sophomore year grades are still dragging it down. That really stinks. But maybe really strong test scores could show how you've improved as a student, right? And that's something you can write about in your essay too, right? This is like a narrative, a story you can tell about yourself as a student. I had these personal things going on sophomore year. My GPA isn't as high because of that. But if you look at my junior year GPA only and these test scores I just took, it shows how much I've improved and how much I've refocused myself. Again, what's the story you're telling there? And again, that's where you can use the essay as well to talk about these kinds of things. Section scores matter, right? So even if your composite score is like in the middle range, right? It's important to think of the breakdowns, right? So I was just talking about this. Not all 1400s are created equal. Let's say you're applying to a selective engineering program. You have a 1400 total. That's a 600 verbal and an 800 in math. This is the SAT. It's a perfect math SAT score, by the way. Oh my gosh. Yeah, 1400's a little low for this particular program, for example, but a perfect score in math is so impressive. Absolutely, right? On the other hand, let's say it's the other way around. Let's say you have 600 math, which is still a good school, a good score, but this is a very selective engineering program. And you have an 800 verbal, which is awesome. That's a perfect verbal, but it's not really relevant to the situation, right? On the other hand, that would be a great thing to send in for like a creative writing program or something, right? So again, just think about these section scores even more specifically if you are applying to specific programs and things like that, or schools that, like that. For example, maybe MIT, right? MIT probably would really enjoy that 800 math score. The biggest thing, though, is you can't unsee a weak score. Again, if you send in those test scores, the test optional schools will assume you meant to send them in, and they will look at them. So it inevitably becomes part of the conversation. So again, it's just that you become more strategic, right? You think about, do I want to send these scores in? It could be that you wait till you've taken the test twice, see if you get, an increase, and then see what your score looks like after that and send them in. So again, it's just become more strategic and a little more complicated. There's some more decisions to make. So again, you want to kind of wait till the end. Okay, I've taken the test 2 times. This is what I've gotten. How I feel about these, and then make those decisions. So again, it's just more sitting down and thinking about each school differently. So all that being said, how about the SAT? The SAT does have some changes coming up, and I did want to include this here because for those of you thinking about test optional, you may be affected by some of this weird SAT stuff coming up. So there are a couple changes. The subject test and the essay both ended in 2021, and they are going to start digital testing this year and next. So this year, it's international digital testing starting in March. And I believe a lot of students that are taking the PSAT this fall. It will also be digital. Your school should know whether or not that's you. That's good because that gives you a kind of time to test it out and see how you feel about it. And then in March of 2024, the domestic test will go digital, which is the one in the US based. So again, if you are like a junior right now, you probably can still take the paper test. This fall and things like that. If you're a sophomore, you want to test early, you can. But later than that, you probably have the options to take the paper or the digital. And you may like one over the other. You may like the digital, and that's totally fine. But it's just something to be aware of. So how does that change? The test is going to be shorter. You're going to get more time to answer each question, so there's less emphasis on speed. The reading passages are going to be shorter too and cover a wider range of topics, whatever that means. They haven't given us much detail beyond that. You will have a calculator throughout the math test. There's no non-calc. The top score will still be 1600, so still comparable there. But no matter what happens, Alpharuth is ready. So we've been in business for over 20 years and we've, stayed on top of changes. We currently offer some digital SAT and ACT practice tests. And as we learn more, we'll release more materials. And so just keep that in mind. We have webinars about digital SAT and all kinds of other information. Our newsletters are really helpful too. So if you want to learn more about that, definitely just keep in touch with us. And before we start the questions, there's going to be a quick poll put in the chat for you guys. If you guys don't mind filling that out for me really quick. All right, as you guys are filling that out, we do have a special event coming up. February 25th to 26th is winter testing weekend. We're offering free SAT and ACT practice tests, some strategy sessions, and a lot more. So if you go to our main website, you can see all about that stuff. This is a great option to kind of take a practice test of each and see where you're at, kind of get a baseline score to start making some of these decisions, right? See how you want to move forward. That being said, let's get to the questions. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function. We have a couple already. Okay. Okay, so the very first question, are there any exceptions to that binding early decision application? So if my child applies early decision, they get admitted, but they didn't receive enough scholarships or funding to attend, will they let them out of the contract for that school? So that is the one exception. It's a good question, right? The one exception to that early decision thing is if it's not economically feasible for your family. You do have to, I think, show your FAFSA form to show that you guys can't afford it. And that situation is totally fine. So it's a good question, right? And I mean, technically it's not a binding contract, but if you were to break that contract without this reason, right, just for another reason, doesn't look good on you. It could affect maybe if you have a sibling later on that wants to go to the school, they may not want to let you in or something. That's a good question though, right? That is actually the only one exception. It's the funding thing. Good question though. Yeah. Okay, if you don't send in scores, does that mean the scores can't be part of a super score? Yes, yeah. Typically, when you send in your SAT scores, it sends the whole list of your scores. And so it's a good question. Let me kind of draw this out for you guys. Okay, let's say it's SAT, for example. So let's say you take the SAT. Let's say the first time you take it, you get 650 in English and you get 600 in math. Awesome. Let's say you take it again. Let's say that was March. Let's say you take it again in May. You get 650 in English again. That's annoying, I know. Your math goes up though to 620. You're really proud of that. Let's say you take it one more time in June. Your English goes down, which is annoying, right? 640. But you really worked on your math and you bumped it all the way up to 660. Okay, so what happens is super scoring, just for those of you who don't know, means you kind of take the best of each section and that becomes like your best of score. So the best of score you could send in would be a 650 plus 660, right? And so this is a good question, right? You do need to send in the scores for them to super score them, right? And some people are kind of scared that, okay, are they going to see this guy though? Are they going to see the ones that went lower? Are they going to see this? 90% of schools who do super score aren't going to sit there and file through all the different tests you've taken. They're going to look at your super score. So even if a school is test optional, if you send in a super score, they're going to really just look at the super score. They're not going to look through all the different scores you sent, if that makes sense. So even if you start with a weak score, but you improve it to where you want to be, it is still totally fine to send in all the scores, if that makes sense. The only exception there would be if something's really weird, if it was really low and it went up really high, that would flag something strange there, that, okay, that's a little too high, is there something going on? Other than that, though, nothing to worry about. So hopefully that answers, it's kind of a complicated answer. Are there any new things with the ACT? Not that we've heard of, actually. They've kind of been a little quiet. No plans to go digital or anything from them, really, which is interesting. Do most colleges super score? Yes. So I say about 90% of schools will super score the SAT, about 80% will super score the ACT. So for example, for any school you're looking at, you pretty much just want to make a list. But you want to think about, oops, sorry, move some of these. You want to see if they're super scoring each. Yeah, okay, good question. Yeah, sorry, that was a little confusing. I don't understand the super scoring. It's correct that they will see all the scores, but you can't unsee a low score, right? That's a good point. So the idea behind this is that you can't unsee a low score if that's the score you send in, right? So let's say you have application 1. Student has a 4.0 GPA. We're just going to stick with the 4.0 scale. President of student council. And let's say they have a 1200 SAT. The school's really, really competitive. That's their max score. That's their super score. Let's say you have application 2, super score, but they had previously gotten 1100. Oops, let me move this up. Let's say application 2 here, right? You have a 3.8 GPA, some sort of other leadership position. I can't think of one. But they have a 1000 SAT. In this situation, this student should still send in this super score, right? Because even though they had previously gotten 1100, the school doesn't care. They will only look at their highest. This student shouldn't send it in, right? Because their highest score is a weak score compared to the rest of their credentials. Does that make sense? So again, they're going to look at your highest possible score, but if your highest possible score isn't really strong, then that's going to have an effect on it. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, it's really complicated and nuanced, right? How many times should a student take the SAT or ACT? Is there a place where it's too much? Yes, it's a good question. So at Appleworth, we recommend you plan for 3 tests. So you take the SAT 3 times or the ACT 3 times. And because we've really seen, in the past 20 years, we've really seen that after 3 tests, you don't see any significant increases from students anymore, maybe a point or 2 at most. And again, that'd be like a situation like that Alabama scholarship we saw, right? Where you need 1 more point. Okay, maybe worth taking it a 4th time. But beyond that, we just really don't see that many improvements beyond 3 tests. It's more just stressful for the student. You could take it more times. It would start to get weird, I think, around test 8 or 9, probably. You are technically allowed to take it as many times as you want. And I don't know this, but I would feel like after 8, 9, 10 tests, it starts to be a little strange and kind of be lengthy there. So it's a good question though. Again, we just recommend 3, 4 if you just need to squeeze out like 1 more point or something. That's reasonable as well. Yeah, how do you think through reporting the score for test optional schools? Okay, in the 50% range, I think I know what you mean. Yes, let me clear this up a little bit too. Yeah, so I'm going to clarify some of this for you, those of you guys who don't know some of this stuff, right? So whenever you're researching a school and you want to list all the schools you're thinking about, you're going to go to Google, right? Type in the name of your school, whatever it is. I'm going to say UGA, that's where I went. Then you're going to put in the words freshman profile. Those are the magic words. Schools love to brag about their most recently admitted class. And so most of them have a page that says, wow, look at this, our freshman class. There's kids from 50 countries and this many names. I don't know, something like that, right? Fun facts. But what it's also going to have, it's going to have numbers about GPA and test scores, right? So you go to the test score part and you're going to look for the middle 50th percentile. So if you only see 1 number, it's probably that one. Some schools only put that number up. Some schools put other numbers up. And so the idea behind the middle 50th percentile, that's the middle 50% of students who were accepted, right? So, that's the kids in this middle range right here. So, those are the kids you want to compare yourselves to, right? We don't want to compare ourselves to the kids in the low range, right? Let me do the opposite way, that's silly. In the low range, because those kids are probably either played a sport or their family gave a lot of money to the school or something. So unless you have a lot of money laying around, probably not worried about that number. We want to look at these numbers right here, and that's the range we want to be in, right? We're not going to worry about the highest. That didn't matter. That, you know, sure they got in, but we want to look at this middle number. And that is really what we call your competitive set. There we go. So that's what you were just asking, right? How do we figure out those numbers? Yeah, I would base it on that. So, you know, for example, let's say the middle 50th percentile for some school is 1,400 to 1,500 or something. The idea is that you want to be in that range to be a competitive application, right? And then, you know, that helps you decide, do I send my scores into this school or not? Two schools could be different, right? Maybe you have two different schools on your list. You know, one school, that's their range, another school, it's a 1250 to a 1350. Let's say you have a 1350. Maybe you send it into that one school, but not the other, right? That's kind of just the decisions you make there based on those ranges. Okay, so this next question, what's a ballpark average increase in score you've seen with test prep? Also, do you see a significant difference in one-on-one prep versus a small class or self-study online with your software? Okay, it's a good question. I don't have super exact numbers for you. I do know a big number. So if for a student who does 20 hours of prep, does all their homework, takes mock tests regularly, is perfect student, we have seen on average a 120-point SAT increase and a 4-point ACT increase. Again, that's on average. And it also depends on your starting score. If you're starting at a 33 ACT, you can't go up 4 points, right? So as far as differences between one-on-one and group classes, that also would depend on your score. I would say students who are lower or higher scoring do better with one-on-one prep. Students in the middle range, they do pretty well in the classes. Typically students in the middle range just need to refresh on concepts and get a couple tips and tricks as far as strategies go. Students in the lower range may need to go back and work on some core concepts. And a student in the higher range may need to work on some of those crazy advanced concepts that the class isn't gonna really go over. So that's kind of my difference there, right? I would say it depends on your starting score. The self-study program is really great. It also depends on your student though. You have to force your student to do it and they're not actually doing it, probably not. But if you have a really high achieving, you know, self-starter student who wants to do it on their own time, I'd say it fits really well for them too. I don't have numbers for the classes or the self-study, unfortunately, but hopefully that gives you kind of an idea. And what's really good is we do have program advisors at our office, so you can give them a call and they're happy to talk all of this over with you, and they can give you recommendations based on your kids, your students' starting score and, you know, what they're wanting to get to. So test optional schools still report an average ACT or SAT, but aren't those average scores now skewed? You are 100% correct. Absolutely, right? Because only students who feel like they did well are sending them in. So you totally got that right. Absolutely. So, you know, it could be more that we are being more reasonable with this middle number, right? Maybe we are even accepting that if we're closer to the bottom number, it's probably good, right? Because there's probably a lot of kids who got accepted who are really here, but just didn't send their scores in, right? You were totally right on that. And the thing that's kind of frustrating about that is we can't know the numbers, right? That's kind of crazy because we don't know the numbers of the kids who got in but didn't send their test scores in. So you're totally right that they're skewed, and we just have to know that they're skewed when we're looking at them. Yeah, would you recommend to try both the SAT and the ACT, see which is a better fit? Absolutely, yeah. So what I would do is take one either one official or practice test of both. Either is fine. Practice test also totally works. So take a practice test of both, and then what you can kind of do is once you get those scores, you can go online and you can look at a SAT, ACT conversion comparison table. Lots of websites have that. So you just go on there and they're like, oh, 21 on the ACT is equal to this on the SAT. And you kind of see, like, does your child have a natural, are they just better at one over the other, which is totally possible. So that's really kind of the first step in this process if you do think testing is part of your application. If your child isn't necessarily better at one over the other, the question is really just which one did they hate less, right, at the end of the day. So you have a little more flexibility in that situation. That is also really what, our winter testing weekend is a good opportunity for that, because we do offer both SAT and ACT practice tests. So you take like the SAT on Saturday and the ACT on Sunday, and you're able to get those scores and compare them. So it's a good opportunity to do that. We offer those periodically throughout the year as well. So if now's not a good time, we offer them during the summer as well. What is the score range to determine the SAT versus ACT? I've heard ACT benefits those with 1250 or higher. So I'm not really sure exactly what you're asking, but so I think you're talking about like the spread of scores, right? So it's interesting. I never heard that before, the 1250 or higher thing. I would say, I mean, I get what you're saying, right? Because the SAT technically has more intervals, right, than the ACT. So I guess it would just depend, right? And that's also where you can kind of start with that initial testing, right? And kind of see which one is my student stronger at. High scoring students, I feel like that would apply to, right? If you have a student who is super high scoring, sometimes it's easier to get a 36 than a 1600 in that situation, right? So it's a good question. And I would say that probably only applies to really, and so by high scoring students, I mean above 1500 on the SAT and above 34 on the ACT. For those students, I would really consider, getting down to the nitty gritty of that. Good question. Never heard that before. Okay, regarding the test optional concept, if you don't send in scores, are you not just telling the school that you didn't get that score? Not necessarily. So the schools you would take a very holistic approach to it. If you didn't send in your scores, they're going to pretend like they never knew scores existed. And as far as the technicalities of that, I don't know much, unfortunately, but no, they consider them equally. So they won't assume that's a test score you got. They will look at your GPA and your other things. But again, right, you want to think about, are my other things strong, right? Does my application look good without those numbers? That could be something too, right? Maybe you, maybe you have anxiety and you're not a great test taker, and that's totally fine. Your GPA shows great stuff and you've done 100 hours of volunteer work and things that are also very impressive but aren't quantitative. That can really benefit those kinds of students. So they're not going to assume that, maybe you just never took the test. You never know what you got in the first place. So thankfully they are pretty holistic about it. Are there some schools that favor SAT over ACT? Nope, all schools consider them equally across the US. Nope, so no matter what program you're applying to, those are going to be equal. But again, right, those specific things too. For some reason, if the ACT math is easier for you than the SAT math and you're applying for an engineering program, that could lead you one way or something, right? So just things to consider there. Oh, really great questions, you guys. Send them in. Ooh, are there any schools that ask the question, did you take the SAT or ACT? I don't believe they ask that. I think they just ask, like, do you want to submit the scores? It looked differently if you took the test and chose not to submit. They wouldn't know if you took the test and chose not to submit. So as far as I know, no schools ask anything super specific like that. Like I said, they're pretty like, oh, if you submit them, we'll look at it. And if you don't, we won't. Also remember, again, admissions offices are pretty thinly staffed. So some of those questions too, right? Not going to really get into the nitty gritty of a lot of that stuff. So I'll wait for any other questions. I'll kind of talk about a good, taking all this information from this and, what are kind of some next steps you and your student can do, your family can do. So the biggest thing is really researching schools. Research is going to be your friend as far as this goes, right? Because again, we have to make more nuanced decisions about every single application. It's not just a send them all out situation anymore. And you want to ask yourself questions about these schools. Do they super score, right? First thing. What's the middle 50th percentile? You want to think about, are there scholarships affected by test scores? Like you have to send us a minimum test score for some of those scholarships. You want to think, are there programs that require scores? And then, take practice SAT, ACT, and see how your scores compare. Right? And then you make decisions, right? So you take your list of schools. I recommend, making a family Google Doc or putting a notebook on the dining room table or however you guys want to do it, sitting down and looking at these schools and asking yourself these questions, right? So if the scores you get, if those are looking good for some of these schools you're looking at, and you feel like it tells a good story, yeah, definitely. If the scores you get aren't looking good for some of those schools you're looking at, then you start to think, okay, is there a way I craft my application where I don't send in these scores? My application still looks really strong. Maybe it is like an art school, right? Like, gosh, there's so many art schools. I don't know, a school that's really art based, right? Like SCAD down here in the South, Savannah College of Art and Design. Maybe it's an art school and you had a local gallery show some of your work. That looks amazing, right? Art school probably doesn't care about test scores, right? So if you feel like they're pretty good, like, oh, I actually did pretty well, I was expecting that, send it in, right? That gallery piece is going to be so much more impressive to them. So again, you think about that. I was thinking about, the individual sections we talked about too, right? Is your math score super high? Or can you work on the scores? If they're not where you want them right now, would a little bit of work bump them up into that range? Or, right, maybe you have an almost perfect verbal score and you want to apply to a creative writing program. Is it worth it to do some studying and bump that guy up some more, right? So again, there's some questions you kind of ask yourself. And then you kind of see, mark if if you're sending scores to each school, right? So not to this one, but to this one. Just make those decisions, right? Something you can also involve your college counselor at school in as well. Okay. I was told by our high school counselor that in order to send the colleges a transcript with no test scores, we had to remove them from our official transcript from the high school. Does this limit our chances of merit scholarship? I actually don't know about that. I believe that might be specifically to your school. I don't think all schools keep track of that on the transcript. So I'm really sorry. I haven't heard of that before. So it might just be your specific school. Sorry about that. Would it affect merit scholarship? So I guess if you remove them from the official transcript, but you decide you want to send them later, you could go to the official SAT or ACT website and send them. There's like a fee. It's like $15, I think, last time I checked. And you could have them sent separately, might be my suggestion. But yeah, sorry I can't be more helpful for that one. Last year, students who decided to not send in tests didn't do as well as those who did at big state schools, okay? It's looking the same again this year for early action. So with students with lower test scores not bothered to apply. I actually haven't heard that yet. So I'm not sure where you're getting that from, but that sounds really interesting. Yeah, to see those kinds of results didn't do as well. So as far as didn't do as well, do you mean like getting in or like grade wise? For students with lower test scores not bothered to apply. I don't know. I guess it would also kind of depend on the school, maybe. It's a good question. Yeah, sorry, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that data yet. Getting admitted. Okay, they did better. Getting admitted. Okay. Well, again, you want to think about a big state school and how many applications they get and how probably swamped they are. And if a good test score is easier to admit, is right at the end of the day, it's easier just to say yes to a lot of students with decent test scores. And then if you think about it too, a lot of the class is probably filled by the time they get to those other, the kids who didn't have as high of a test score, who didn't go to the top of the pile. So I don't think necessarily they shouldn't bother to apply, but I think it is also the idea of like, you need to make the rest of your application strong. Because at this point, instead of having a number on the top of your application, they have to read it. They have to go through it. What's standing out, right? So which is different, right? It becomes more of a qualitative thing. And so again, are you doing those really impressive things like 200 hours of volunteering? Are you going to conferences? Are you showing your work at galleries? Again, it kind of becomes those above and beyond things you want to start to show off more. So again, it's harder. Honestly, all of this is harder. It's become more time consuming as a result of this test optional stuff. So it's a good question. I haven't heard of that yet. That sounds interesting. Something interesting too that I just thought of earlier, someone asked if they were skewed slightly. So yeah, the test scores are skewed slightly, the reports, right? Because students who do well are submitting higher test scores. But something else I've kind of seen at some schools I've been at recently, test scores are a little bit down in general though, because of COVID learning, right? Students who are like juniors now are learning their core algebra during the COVID year and are having trouble. So something that also to consider, which has been just interesting. I had one school show me some data. So just something else to think about too. All right. Yes. Keep sending on questions. If you guys don't have any more questions, y'all are free to go. Of course. Thanks for joining us. I hope you sign up for the winter testing weekend or come join us on another webinar, sign up for our newsletter. And again, as we learn more about stuff like the digital SAT and learn more about the data and stuff with test optional, we'll definitely be sharing it with you guys. Yeah, keep sending in questions if you have questions. For this year's applicants, are you seeing any trends about more or fewer students submitting test scores than last year? So we don't really know a lot about that yet. So for example, students who just applied this past fall would really make their decisions in May. I believe there's it's April or May. I'm sorry, I can't remember the day, but it's kind of like decision day across the US where like they have to say they're going to enroll. And so colleges are really going to only get their data from the kids who enroll probably. So we don't hardly have that yet. I imagine probably we'll have that by the end of the summer, maybe. Something else to look out for. But yeah, good question. Any other questions I can answer for you guys? These are all really great questions tonight. Thank you for bringing them. Okie dokie. Well, if that's it, again, thanks for joining us tonight. If you guys have anything you want to talk about Apple Ruth-wise, at the bottom of the screen, you see our email and our phone number. We are available Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Eastern. Happy to help you guys. And again, I hope you join us for some of our other presentations to learn more about the college admissions process in general. But yeah, thanks for joining us tonight.